Hi, and welcome to the Warrior episode of the ArsenalPass limited time only heavy hitter season. Let's get right into it. In my mind, Kassai and Olympia are both toward the top left corner of this chart that you've seen, a few times by now, where they are pretty good at using 4 to 5 card hands. So that places them left on this chart. And why is that? It's because none of the class cards require an action point. So if you have a lot of these class cards, you have a lot of these warrior cards in your deck, then basically your deck is filled with 1-for-3s as reds and then blues and yellows on top. So you can always use your pitch cards, use your reds, and use your weapons in the Centauri Sabers to spend every card in your hand. It may not be on rate, but at least you're spending it one way or another, and then you're not stuck with cards in hand like Guardians are often. And why are they more toward the top of this chart? Well, that's because many warrior games end with Kassai or Olympia hitting you with an attack reaction and killing you from 2 life, 3 life, maybe even 5 or 6 life if they have a couple at an opportune spot. And you could put it another way. Why are they not at the bottom of this chart? Well, that's because their cards, as said many times before, are generally below rate. It's most of the cards are a 1-for-3 go again, where then you hit with the Centauri Saber, it's a 2-card 5. If you have 2 of these 1-for-3 go agains, then it's a 3-card 8. So it's still not very good. You're basically losing a couple points of value there from what you should be doing. 3 cards should get you 10, 2 cards should get you 7, combined with your action point. And the way the warriors basically do that is with the agility token, or if the opponent starts blocking with attack actions. Because once they start blocking with attack actions, you start clawing back some of those below rate cards because you're maybe making some tokens, or your Centauri Saber is going up in attack value, etc., etc. So you kind of need interaction from the opponent, or you need agility tokens, or in some cases vigor tokens to be on rate. Let's then look at a little different angle than for the other classes. So here we have all the warrior rares and commons. And we can, this is a pretty good way to understand how a hero or a class plays in limited is when you look at their commons and rares and what are those slots made up of. And here, as you can see, the rares are all attack reactions. The commons are 2 attack reactions, 2 wager pumps, and 2 non-wager pumps. And of course, a beverage, as every class has in this set. 6 out of 10 of these commons and rares are basically 1-for-3 pumps or reactions. So you're very consistently can expect that the warrior has a 1-for-3 or a couple of 1-for-3s in their hand, because most of their class commons and rares do exactly that. Of course, some of them are sort of front pumps, some of them are back pumps, but it's 1-for-3s all the same. 5 out of 10 punish you for blocking the warrior attack with attack actions. So it's basically 4 of the attack reactions that get, either are enabled in the first place in the case of fatal engagement, or are, getting a lot better if you blocked with an attack action. And then engaged Swift Blade it's not a surprise, it's on the board, but it's still can punish in the right situation by giving, for example, another sword attack after that if you block it with an attack action. 3 of these create agility and 3 of these create vigor, so there's a bit of a balance here. Of course, the goblet creates both. What does all that mean combined with the hero abilities? Well, warrior, first of all, kind of in general, punishes if you have to block, or you happen to block in the wrong spot with attack actions. because this allows the warriors to go from below rate to even above rate. because you get both the Centauri Saber buff, you might get the Engage Swift Blade trigger, and you might get some tokens on top from your attack reactions. And warriors kind of, this is one side of warriors, and the other side of warriors is that they usually finish the game with attack reactions because there are no defense reactions in the set. There are some instants there, that prevent damage, but quite often if you're at 3 life and they play an agile engagement, it's the end of the game. So that's quite often how these games end. And that's also a part of your game plan, is to grind the game to a point where both of you are sort of below 5 life, and then you have a huge advantage as the warrior. Because with just a 2-card hand you can end the game. Then if you look at the heroes separately, Kassai uses agility, card draw, and gold creation to generate value and to generate these uncomfortable blocking situations. So when you're drafting Kassai, you're valuing card draw and agility a little bit higher. And why is that? Well, card draw is obvious because every time you draw a card, your sabers get, or your swords get cheaper. And kind of linked to that, you are valuing agility higher because getting 1 sword to be cheaper is not that great. But if you get 2 swords to be cheaper, then it's double the value on that card draw. So you want enough agility to be able to use the card draw ability efficiently, basically. And of course, you value yellows much higher than Olympia and much higher than most other heroes because you need some of those for your other ability. But let's come back to that. Olympia then threatens with wagers or wager attacks, whether they are attack actions or sword attacks, and then pushes them through with reactions. And what they do with the gold is basically Olympia uses that in connection with vigor tokens to smooth out their hands. 2 vigor and a gold is an extra card. A vigor and a blue and 2 gold is basically an extra card. So you can use those vigor tokens with the gold to smooth out the hands in a much better way than if you didn't have the vigor. And what Olympia then values when drafting is wagers, attack reactions, and vigor tokens higher. And since everybody values agility higher than vigor in general in the draft process, what you might end up noticing is that if you don't have enough agility, that's when you could start thinking about going Olympia, because Olympia is not dependent on agility in any way. Warrior has 3 main strengths. First of all, attack reactions are fantastic finishers, and they also combine well with all the wagers in the set. Because wagers, incentivize blocking, and attack reactions, they punish for that blocking. They also have good weapons that very efficiently use both agility and vigor tokens. So creating these tokens is, I would say much more often useful than it could be for someone like Guardian. You're much more often generating 2 value from agility than, for example, Guardian is generating 2 value from, let's say, might. And you're much more often actually utilizing vigor and maybe even generating 2 value out of vigor compared to Guardian, who basically needs kind of like a 4 cost attack to really utilize vigor well. And it's also, funnily enough, the best blocking class, because not only does it have the highest average block value in commons and rares, it has attack reactions which get around overpower. All of the cards basically get around Centauri Saber and all these agile engagement type effects. So Warrior is just sneakily very good at blocking. And when you're sneakily very good at blocking and your cards are kind of below rate on offense, then the games can actually get a little bit grindy. So it's probably a good idea to fill your deck with a lot of these 3 blocks and so on. And what that also means is, especially in the Warrior Mirror, you might want to have more than 30 cards. Because the Warrior Mirrors are especially the ones that get grindy, because nobody gets extra value on offense from the opponent blocking with attack actions. So if nobody gets extra value on offense, then both are pretty mopey at offense at that point, and then both of them are pretty good at defense. So these games tend to go pretty grindy, pretty long, and end up being fatigue affairs quite often. So what are the warrior weaknesses, and how do you exploit these? Well, as already said many times, cards are underrated on offense, so you can race a warrior. You can even take a full turn of the warrior's damage from a 5-card hand, and it may not be more than 10, 11 damage. You can still live and come back at them for 14 or 15 if you're KO, for example. Warriors are also reliant on you blocking them with attack actions. So you want to be drafting and sideboarding some non-attack actions, especially 3 blocks. So let's say you're KO, and there's a pretty poor pack toward the end of the pack. You could be picking like a yellow rising power, or even a red rising power, but you already have a pretty good deck. You have a good 30 in place. You don't really need that 31st card there. Or you could be picking a yellow Bonebreaker Bellow. Then if you have a hunch that there's a lot of warriors in the pod, it might be better to pick the yellow 3 block and side it in when you're facing these warriors. Next, let's take a look at the equipment. First of all, of course, you want the specialization hats, but they're built a little bit different, right? Priced Galea, whatever it's called, is much, much better than the hood. And why is that? Well, very simple. It blocks 3, right? Sometimes you use the ability. It can be extremely useful when you have, let's say, a take the upper hand in your deck, but you've run out of very good wager cards. So you're basically, you have a take the upper hand parked in Arsenal, but you don't have a 3-for-7 wager left or a red edge ahead or whatever. You don't really want to be, wasting a blue edge ahead or something like that to be played just so that you can activate the take the upper hand. So this acts as kind of a safety valve for that. But most of the time, it's probably blocking 3, which is fantastic. It's A+. Hood of Red Sand, really good, but a little bit conditional, right? And of course, just blocks 1. It blocks 1, and then it very conditionally draws you a card. And what does very conditionally mean? Well, you need to be able to use the card, and you need to be able to, or you need to make sure that the attack hits. Of course, you can kind of know if the attack is hitting unless they have one of these instants. That can be a bit of a blowout. If you use the hat, then they have a slap happy or something. But most of the time, that doesn't happen. But then how do you use the card? Well, you probably should have an agility so that you can play the card after you draw it and you have, more of your turn left. Because if you're just drawing a card for Arsenal, probably half the time it's going to be something that you might get some value out of, like 1 or 2 value out of, but not much more than that. So it's not a full card that you're drawing in value terms, especially since you're playing probably like 12, 13 blues, maybe like 7 yellows. So it's like 2/3 of the time almost that you're not drawing a red off of it to Arsenal. Chest slot, Vigor Girth is fine. It's not great. It's not terrible. It's good, especially when you're prepping for a big turn. You're arsenaling some key card or something like that. You can pop it. So just to make sure that you have the resources. Let's say you're arsenaling draw swords with Kassai, then that could be a good spot because draw swords kind of wants like a double blue or a blue and yellow or something like that. So this helps a lot with that setup. Confront adversity can be equally good, I would say. I don't see a big difference between the two. Of course, in the perfect world, you have both. Leg slot, flat trackers, fantastic. Not nearly as good as with Brute, because you can already, stack all of your pumps onto one sword attack if you want. So you don't really need the agility to be able to use your entire hand. But most of the time, if you have the agility, you can, of course, manufacture a situation where that agility is worth 2 points of damage. You can block with some extra cards and so on, so that you can very precisely spend your blue. So it's still really, really good. And Beckon Applause, it's fine, and it kind of is a range. I put a B- here. It's probably more like a C plus in most decks, but you can try to draft your deck in a way where it becomes more of a B minus, and that's to grab the goblets and try to stack your tokens on the same turn. So maybe you play a hold'em and then an agile engagement on the same turn. You maybe arsenal one, wait for the other, something like that. So it can be something anything between sort of C plus and B, depending on how many of these double token turns you have. Hot Streak is the better one of the rare weapons. It's actually really, really good. I put it at a B. I haven't played with it, but I've played against it, and it's humongously annoying. Let's say you're playing Guardian. What are you going to do? Are you going to not block? It's not really a good option either, because you're stuck with 4 cards or 5 cards in hand, and then you can't spend that whole hand. So especially against Guardian, this is insanely good. Of course, Brute players can, on most turns, they can just ignore it and not block it, but Guardians have a very tough time against Hot Streak. And then Parry Blade, have not played with it, have not played against it very much, but I put it as C plus. I think it's fine, especially I would say in a very attack heavy and agility light deck, like an Olympia deck that doesn't have a lot of agility but has a lot of attacks. This can be pretty good because it's less risky to break it. It doesn't have to be like the last turn of the game when you break it, but you can break it 1 or 2 turns earlier and still be able to attack full on with your full deck and not have to worry about not having 2 weapons. The other best alternatives, Face Adversity is really, really good. It just gets turned on against most of the heroes. Against some Guardians, it has a bit of a tough time getting value, but against pretty much everybody else, it has some value. Maybe not so much against Rhinar, but you don't really face Rhinars that often. For Kassai, Glory Seeker is actually really good. It's like starting with a silver on board, which of course doesn't sound that great, but it's basically netting you 2 free value. You pop it on your agility turn, you get 2 free sword swings for and draw the card to replace the blue. Embrace Adversity is kind of a C plus. Overcome Adversity is more like a B minus. It's a little bit better than the others because it works against sort of 6/8 of the field, or I guess 5/7 if you're one of the 8. So it's a little bit more often useful than the other 2, and it blocks on the turn when it matters most, probably. So then let's look at an example of a Kassai hand that's very strong. So let's assume you had an agility pop at the start of your turn. You have a draw swords, hold them red in hand, and then a couple of blues, like a cut the deck and a goblet, just to get you in the mindset of what are the good blues you probably want to be drafting. And then you have an agile engagement in Arsenal. So this is very good for a few reasons. One of those is that you have draw swords and you have the extra blue. And also, of course, it's a goblet. So even if you draw a blue off of the draw swords, you still have use for, having basically 3 blues on your turn. So you can go, draw swords, draw a card, depending on what you draw. If it's a 1 cost pump, then fantastic. You can just, play all 3 pumps, or you can play Hold'em, Agile Engagement, and whatever you drew, and attack with the swords twice. That's an insanely strong turn, of course. Or if it's a blue, you can, pitch it for Hold'em and attack, and then, play the Agile Engagement on whichever attack they block with an attack action. And then you can sort of arsenal the goblet, or depending a little bit on what happens, right? So if you somehow manage to both not win the wager and not be blocked by an attack action, which is kind of strange, then you probably, then you play the goblet right away. But most of the time with this kind of hand, you would probably end up arsenaling the goblet, waiting for a good turn to pop it when you don't have an agility otherwise, and maybe when you're arsenaling a good card that benefits off of the goblet or the agility and vigor tokens. Or maybe when you have a gold later on, that's when you also want the agility. Then an example of an Olympia hand is, and do note that these are kind of your dream scenarios, and you've somehow magically been able to keep the whole hand. But I'm just trying to get you in the mindset of what your target turns look like. So here you have a gold on board and a vigor popped at the start of your turn. You have a couple blues, you have a wage vigor, and you have take the upper hand red. And then you have a rising speed in Arsenal. So here you can start by popping the gold, and then you can kind of, I guess it doesn't even, maybe it depends a little bit on what you drew, but most of the time you're probably playing rising speed. So that's the vigor and the blue are together 4. So that's gold plus rising speed. So you're coming in for 5 go again. And you still have 3 cards left. So after that, of course, you attack with the wage vigor. And if they block it, you can take the upper hand and get over the top. At this point, you will not have any resources left. So you will just have take the upper hand and the card you drew in your hand. So unless I don't really see a scenario where you draw another 0 cost other than another take the upper hand. So basically, you're forced to play this in order to arsenal the other card. But of course, if they're letting it hit and you drew a blue, especially if you drew a blue 3 block, then it's completely fine to not play the reaction and arsenal it instead and keep the blue in hand. But that very much requires knowledge about the rest of your deck. So are you going to have more opportunities to play take the upper hand? Because the worst game is when you kind of have that stuck in arsenal and then you realize that I don't have any targets for it anymore. So probably 90% of the time you would play the take the upper hand. So that's 5 plus 7 plus 3 with a card in arsenal and a vigor for next turn as well. So super strong. So knowing everything we know by now, what are the top commons and rares for warrior? So of course you have prized Galea at the top. Lead with speed, I think, is probably pretty close. It's extremely good. It is one of those cards that kind of ensures you have 2 good turns in a row, which not very many cards do. Then you have Hood of Red Sand, you have Flat Trackers, you have Hot Streak. These we already talked about. But then at the top, I think you have the best reactions. And to me, the best reactions are Agile Engagement, red, and Cut the Deck red. And why is Cut the Deck so good? Well, it blocks 3. It is a reaction that blocks 3. It is still a 1 for 3, so it's it's not as sort of telegraphed as a Fatal Engagement. And the ability is actually kind of useful in Kassai when you have an agility, because the draw card makes your next sword attack or makes all of your sword attacks free. So you can maybe get an extra point of value out of that. It can also smooth out bad hands, extra blues. Maybe you had to put a blue in arsenal at some point, and you have a Cut the Deck in your deck coming up, so that's a pretty good way to get rid of it. But the blocking 3 is also just really strong because it gets around other warriors, it gets around overpower. You really don't want to be blocking with your 2 block reactions in those scenarios. Then for Kassai, we have Draw Swords and Wage Gold. And you're wondering, why is Wage Gold better for Kassai? Well, you want to be wagering for other things than gold as Olympia. And you're not really benefiting that much from the gold because you get it anyway kind of on top. But Kassai, if you're coming in with a 3 for 7, they don't have the equipment to block the breakpoint. They either have to block very inefficiently or give you a gold, which is, at some point in the game, it's probably going to be 2 extra value. So it's a 3 for 7 that has an on hit of 2 extra value. It's really, really strong. Then we have Wage Agility for both heroes, down but not out in red and blue. Really good as for everybody else. Maybe about down but not outs, Warrior is probably the best hero at using all of the tokens. Might, of course, everybody uses pretty easily, but you can also, as a warrior with the 2 swords, you can use the agility and vigor every time. Whereas most other classes would either not be able to use the agility on some of the turns in Guardian's case, or would not be able to use the vigor in many cases, right? Then for Olympia, you have Take the Upper Hand and Wage Vigor up here as well. These are really key cards for Olympia. Going down to the B- range, we have Vigorous Engagement and Edge Ahead, some of the other top warrior commons, and Fatal Engagement blue. I think Fatal Engagement is the best as a blue because it's a blue block 3 attack reaction, so it blocks absolutely everything in the set pretty well. You can pitch it for late game, and then it's a late game kill when both players have like blues in their deck, and of course they're gonna notice that you pitched it, but still it might be hard to play around it forever. For Olympia, we have Wage Gold and Hold'em here. Hold'em is, I would say, much better for Olympia than Kassai because you want the wagers and you want the vigor a little bit more. But Wage Gold is still a very strong card. It's just not as good as Wage Agility or Wage Vigor for Olympia. Then we have some cards you might block with. So Test of Vigor, Test of Strength, Clash of Vigor, and Take It on the Chin. Clash of Vigor is not because you're winning the clash, but it's mostly because you don't mind if you lose the clash. So it's a 2-for-6 block 3, which is pretty good in a hero or in a class that has a lot of 1-for-3s as both reactions and pumps. So this can very easily be a 3-card 9 with a very annoying on hit, or it's a 3-card 6 which turns into a 9 after they've blocked. So if you have the reaction in hand. So it's much easier to go much taller with these attacks than it is with your swords. And that's why these 2-for-6s that are warrior attacks are actually pretty good. So I think this ticks a lot of boxes, even though you sometimes lose the clash when you block with it. Take It on the Chin, of course, really good. A little bit better in Kassai than in Olympia, but I would always play it in both decks. Then we have some of the equipment we already talked about, and finally we have a set of other cards for Kassai that kind of creep into the B- range, I would say, which would be Red Trade-In. You know, it's a 0-for-3 go again if you've had time to set it up in Arsenal, but then it gives you 2 points of extra value on an agility turn. Well, kind of 1 point of extra value, to be honest, because you're losing. If you play this first, then you lose the agility, and then you don't have 2 weapon swings. So it's kind of like a 0-for-4-ish once you put it in Arsenal, which is great, of course. Run into Trouble. It's mostly for Kassai. I'm assuming here that you have more agility as Kassai than as Olympia. So it's not really a card you're actively looking to put in your deck. But if you have a lot of agility, it can be a really nasty game ender, kind of like a mini Reckless Wing. Agile Windup is here. It's just a good 3-for-7 that on turn 0 turns into an agility, or on another turn when you just don't have anything efficient to do. And then Engage Swiftblade. I think this is mostly a Kassai card where you are threatening. Well, you can threaten with just a random sword hit. So you don't need wagers to threaten on hits because you have your gold ability. So you activate Kassai, you play this, and you attack with a sword. They're in a bit of trouble because either they are, blocking, and then they have to block again because you're coming in with the other sword, or then they're not blocking and you're getting the gold. So it's I would say much better in Kassai than Olympia. Example on how to end up on warrior, and this is again, maybe the most common way that I would end up on warrior, but there are of course a million ways to do it. So you start by picking hybrids and generics. Try to stay open. Some examples here, like a down but not out blue, Wage Agility, or Face Adversity, or Wage Gold, something like that. You're probably not getting all 4, but maybe you're getting 3 of these in the 3 first picks. And then you see a warrior is possibly open around pick 4 or 5. So here's an example where a brute common is missing, for example, and then there's a couple pretty good guardian cards and then a couple pretty good warrior cards, and you get a hunch that maybe at least warrior is not super taken, especially if there's like a warrior rare like Fatal Engagement still in the pack. So you pick one of these. Maybe you pick the Edge Ahead just to maybe send a stronger signal than with the Fatal Engagement, and you see what happens. And then you kind of semi-hedge warrior until you confirm the signal. So maybe you can take some vigor, like in this example, you can take some bigger cards, Wage Vigor, Clash of Vigor, something like that, and then see what happens. And once you feel that warrior is truly open, you start picking those cards. So when you do commit to warrior, then what should you end up with? So what does your target deck look like? So here's an example of a Kassai 3-0 deck that I drafted. This is probably the best Kassai deck that I've drafted, to be honest. So I really got pretty much everything I wanted. So this has 13 reds, 7 yellows, out of which 6 are block 3s, and 1 is a lead with speed. And then it has 13 blues. So that adds up to 33 cards. You could, of course, play this also as a 30-card deck. That's completely fine. It has a good amount of agility in edge aheads, lead with speed, goblets, a couple goblets, and agile engagement. And then it also has other go again. So it has a lot of engaged swift blades, which kind of in the end of, or at the end of the game, they kind of act as sort of pseudo agilities because your opponent has to block it. It also has rising speed, which acts as another kind of go against source or go wide source. It has 3 draw swords in red and 1 in yellow, so really contributing to what the core of the deck is trying to do. It has a good amount of yellows, which you need for your hero ability, and they're all either blocking 3 or creating an agility token, so really what you want to be doing. And it has a decent amount of reactions as well. It has the agile engagement, cut the deck, vigorous engagement, and then fatal engagement in yellow as well. So you can end the game with this deck as well. And what you often want to do with warriors, maybe a little bit more than with the other classes, is you might want the rising cards. You don't want them tremendously high. You still didn't see them in my previous pictures of top commons and rare. So I think still they're kind of like C pluses. But probably both Olympia and Kassai could benefit from having kind of one of each. I think Rising Speed is more of an Olympia card because you have so much more to do on your gold turns with Kassai probably. Yeah, even still you kind of want one of each. You probably don't want much more than that. Then if we go to Olympia, here's an example 3-0 Olympia deck that I drafted where you're looking at a slightly different set of things when you look at an Olympia deck. So first of all, do we have wager cards? Well, yes, we have edge ahead red, 2 red hold'ems, a money where your mouth is, and a red wage agility, plus some blues and yellows if we need them. We have 6 attack reactions, so the agile engagement, 2 take the upper hands, which is of course pretty crazy. A vigorous engagement, a yellow cut the deck, which is mostly going to be blocked, and of course an up the ante as well. So it's kind of the dream scenario in many senses. It has a pretty good balance between agility and vigor creation. So it's not like overly indexing on agility when you might end up with double agilities on some turns and lose the value, and you can get more value out of the gold you create by having some vigor in there as well. And it has 14 blues in a 30 card deck. And you're probably thinking, 14 blues, that sounds insanely high. You're drawing 2 blues on most of your turns. Well, that could or could not be a problem, right? If many of your blues block 3, like all the edge aheads, all the hold'ems, draw swords, up the ante, down but not out, they all block 3. So you can quite often block one of the blues if the situation doesn't look like you need it. But also what's true in Olympia is that you end up generating probably 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 gold during the game if you have a good deck. And what you can do with the gold is in the mid game or mid to late game when you're not like fully in your second cycle yet, when you're only drawing blues, is you can cycle those extra blues for new cards, right? And you also want to make sure that you're not waiting until second cycle to start using your golds, because then you're drawing blues for your blues, and that doesn't really give you that much. So you want to make sure that you're using the golds when you have the chance. Otherwise, you'll run out of power cards in your deck if you have half blues. So you're against a bit of a clock, but you can kind of you could play more than 30 cards. I think I had some pretty good cards in the sideboard here. that I would probably play in some of the more grindier matchups, especially against other warriors. But here's a pretty good shell. And again, I have a rising energy red, which can pretty good on a gold turn if you block with several cards, then you pitch a blue to gold, come in with rising energy, and you arsenal the card that you drew. So that's like a 1-card 6. Theoretically, of course, it's a 1-card 6 with a random arsenal card, which is not exactly perfect value, but still. Then let's look at how do you or why do you go Kassai, why do you go Olympia, and what are the ratios for these decks? So the reasons to go Kassai are probably cards like Draw Swords. This is the warrior common that mostly draws you into Kassai. Also, if you happen to have several decent yellows, or especially several block 3 yellows that you're planning to put in your deck, then that draws you more towards Kassai, because she has kind of a double use for those yellows. They're not just block cards, but you can get gold out of them later on. And then if you have a good amount of agility creation, because that's what you need to make use of the card drawing. And why you would go Olympia then is if you have some of the specializations, so Up the Ante or Prize Galea are fantastic. If you have very good wager cards, strong wager cards in red and enough of them, and you maybe have some take the upper hands, I would say you're probably Kassai 60 or 70% of the time, and then you're Olympia 30-40% of the time. And that's fine. But to me, personally, I feel like Kassai is actually kind of harder to build because you need to draft some of these yellows. You need to have a good amount of blues. You need to have a good amount of reds. Your reds really need to make a difference because you have so many yellows. So it's kind of more of a ratio deck than Olympia is. You need to hit this, several sets of target ratios, whereas Olympia is more like just have enough blues and have enough wager cards, throw in some attack reactions, and you're done. So with Kassai, you want sort of 10 to 12 strong reds. And I say strong reds because you don't have as many as Olympia does. You probably want 4+ card draw effects or gold creation effects. They're kind of the same, right? Because the gold is a card draw. So if you have wage gold, 2 draw swords, and you have the hat, then that's already pretty good. You probably want 6 to 8 yellows, more towards 6, I would say. 8 yellow starts to be quite a bit. And you want most of them to block 3 or to do something really useful. So like a lead with speed, yellow is fine. But just any random 2-block yellow, I would avoid drafting that and do something else with that pick. And you probably want 12 to 13 blues, mainly 3 blocks because you have so many. You don't want as many blues as Olympia does because you don't have the as much gold cycling going on, and you have more yellows also to help you out. But you also have draw swords, and draw swords is a very resource intensive card. So you want like a decent amount of blues. Maybe you can get away with 11, but I wouldn't go down to 9 or 10. And then with Olympia, you want probably 5+ red wager cards. Probably want like 4 or 5 attack reactions at least. And maybe 1 to 3 gold payoffs, but they're not as relevant as the other 2 categories. And gold payoffs can be something like a rising energy or a rising speed. And you probably want vigor tokens in line with your 3-for-7s and reactions. And what does this mean? So it means that if you have 5 3-cost wager cards and you have 4 1-cost attack reactions, then vigor becomes extremely powerful because it allows you to attack with that vigor attack or that wager attack, and then come in with the reaction on top without spending an extra card. So that's kind of one of the powers of vigor, and the other one, of course, is the gold, hand smoothing. And you probably want 13 to 15 blues, mainly 3 block. 15 is maybe toward the upper end if you're running a 30-card deck, but quite often with Olympia, you might be running like a 33, 34-card deck, and then you might want to run, completely fine to run 15 blues, maybe even 16 blues on a 34-card deck. In some matchup, of course, in other matchups, you run a straight 30. Finally, let's look at the Warrior Majestics. So I haven't played with all of these, so you see a bit of a squiggly line here, so where I don't exactly know how good it is. But I've theory crafted some of them, and some of them I've actually played with or played against. Blade Flurry is something I've mostly played against, I think. I think for Kassai, it's an absolute A. There is going to be a turn, or the turns are not too far apart when you can get 4 value out of it. So it's pretty safe to arsenal it, try to get an agility token and get 4 value out of it, and add reaction speed. That's insanely good. With Olympia, it's a bit less good, but it's still you are probably going to have a point in time when you have that agility token. So it kind of ranges a little bit. It can be kind of like a C plus if you don't have any agility, and then it goes all the way to an A if you have a lot of agility, or even A plus. Shift the Tide of Battle, I think, is more of a Kassai card. And why is that? Well, you need to go again more, but also it's a yellow block 3. And Kassai anyway wants yellow block 3, so might as well have like a really strong yellow block 3. For Olympia, I think this is more like a C plus at best. Commanding Performance, I have not played with or against this in draft. It's probably pretty good. I think it's kind of like a B. It's the best probably versus Guardian. They're going to have a tough time not blocking. Everybody else can kind of either block with non-attacks or attack reactions, or then ignore your attacks for the turn. But still, really strong if you can put it into a big turn. Up the ante, it's kind of like a B-ish for Olympia. This one I've played with, as you just saw. But it's not that easy to get off. It basically requires another blue, and unless you really just want it to do one thing. If you want it to do one thing or 2 things, then it's not hugely impressive. But if you have an extra blue toward the end of the game, it's also it's very pitch stackable. That's what makes it really good. Is you pitch stack this, and then at the end of the game, you're anyway going to have those extra blues, and this can be an attack reaction for +3 with some wagers. So really good out of your blue pitch stack. Raise an army. Some of you might be surprised that this is so low. I think it's kind of like a C plus. It could be a B minus simply because it's like one of the not better ones, but it's like a decent yellow block 3. But do note that it usually takes a long time for Kassai to be able to generate the first gold, and even longer to generate 2 golds. And by the time you've generated 1 or 2 golds, you play this. How much agility do you have left in your deck? Because you need agility tokens to make use of the sellsword. And you are spending your gold, which anyway, in other cases, if you had the agility token, would have been equal to a couple value. So you're throwing that gold in the bin, then you're creating a sellsword who only does anything on agility turns, which you probably don't have that many left in your deck. So I don't think it's very strong. It's definitely not first pickable. It's not very close to a top 5 pickable. So you probably want it more towards the end of the pack when other people are not on Kassai, or even if they are quite correctly passing it onwards. Thank you for this episode, and I will see you next time. I'm still not sure whether the next episode is a summary one, or if it's going to be a draft review, or if it's a combination of both of those. But I will see you there.